Dreams from My Father, by Barack Obama. Intro. A few months after his 21st birthday, a young man is making breakfast in his small New York apartment. The phone rings. A stranger on the other end, her voice crackling with static from thousands of miles away, delivers a message that will change the course of his life. "Barry," the voice says, "this is your Aunt Jane. In Nairobi. Listen, Barry, your father is dead. He is killed in a car accident." The line cuts off. He sits on the couch, smelling eggs burning in the kitchen, and tries to measure his loss. But how do you measure the loss of someone who was never really there? How do you grieve a ghost? His father had been a myth to him, a collection of stories told by his mother and grandparents, a brilliant, charismatic Kenyan scholar who had left when he was only 2 years old. He was a figure larger than life, a man of strength and principle, a vision of what a black man could be. But he was also an absence, a void at the center of a young man's life. Today, we're diving into one of the most powerful and searching memoirs of our time, Dreams from My Father by Barack Obama. Written long before he became a household name, this book is not a political manifesto. It is something far more profound. It is the story of a boy's search for his father, and through that search, a journey to find himself. It's a story about race, identity, and the inheritance we carry, whether we choose to or not. By the end of our time together, you will understand the deep, personal questions that shaped a future president, but more than that, you will see a roadmap for how any of us can begin to piece together our own identity from the scattered fragments of family, history, and the dreams passed down to us. This is a story about finding your place in the world, especially when you feel like you don't belong anywhere at all. Book summary. So what does a boy do when his father is more of a story than a man? He listens. He collects the myths and holds them close. Growing up in Hawaii, young Barack Obama knew his father through a series of polished, well-worn anecdotes. He was a figure of immense strength and intellect. There was the story of his father, a proud Kenyan of the Luo tribe, dangling a man over a cliff for disrespecting a gifted pipe, a fearsome vision of justice. There was the story of him, the only African student at the University of Hawaii, showing up to a formal award ceremony in jeans and a leopard print shirt, the only time anyone ever saw him embarrassed. These stories painted a picture of a man who was brilliant, confident, and uncompromising. He was black as pitch, his mother white as milk, but in the idyllic setting of Hawaii, this barely registered in the young boy's mind. His father was a hero, a myth, a character in a creation tale. But every myth has a crack in it, a question that lingers. The biggest question of all was, why did he leave, and why didn't he come back? The stories never quite answered that. They couldn't. They were designed to build a world for a boy, not to explain its broken pieces. His father had won a scholarship to Harvard to get his PhD but couldn't afford to take his new family with him. A separation occurred. He returned to Africa to fulfill his promise to the continent, and the bond of love survived the distance. That was the official narrative. But as a child grows, the world begins to present a different, more complicated story. For Barack, that story began to shift when he and his mother moved to Indonesia. His mother had remarried an Indonesian man named Lolo, a kind and gentle soul who introduced him to a world far from the comforts of Hawaii. It was a world of vibrant markets, strange foods like snake meat and roasted grasshopper, and the constant presence of poverty and hardship. It was in a quiet library at the American Embassy in Jakarta that the innocence of his childhood was forever fractured. While flipping through old issues of Life magazine, a 9-year-old Barack came across a photo essay. It was about a black man in America who had undergone a chemical treatment to lighten his skin, hoping to find happiness by passing as white. The article explained that the results were irreversible, and the man was filled with regret. He described the feeling years later as a violent ambush. The knot in his stomach, the heat in his face. He had a desperate urge to show the magazine to his mother, to her boss, to demand an explanation. But he said nothing. He had discovered a hidden enemy, one that could reach him without anyone's knowledge, not even his own. That night, he stood in front of the mirror and wondered, for the first time, if there was something wrong with him. That single photograph changed his vision of the world. He started to notice things he hadn't before. He noticed that on the TV show I Spy, Bill Cosby never got the girl. He noticed that in the Sears Christmas catalog his grandparents sent, Santa was a white man, and there was nobody who looked like him. He began to understand that the world had rules he wasn't yet aware of, and that his mother's stories, full of love and hope, might be incomplete. She had tried to arm him with an unshakable sense of self-worth. She brought home books on the civil rights movement, recordings of Mahalia Jackson, and speeches of Drive King. She told him that every black man was a Thurgood Marshall or a Sidney Poitier, that to be black was to be the beneficiary of a great inheritance, a special destiny. But in the face of that magazine photo, her hopeful message felt fragile. His father's absence was no longer just a personal fact. It was now tied to this larger, more frightening question of race and belonging. When he was 10, his mother decided it was time for him to get an American education. She sent him back to Hawaii to live with his grandparents. He was enrolled in a prestigious prep school, Punahou Academy, a place of lush green fields and opportunity. But for a boy coming from the streets of Jakarta, it was a world of quiet alienation. On his first day, the other kids giggled at his name, Barack. One boy asked him if his father ate people. He was an outsider. And it was during this time that he learned one of the most painful lessons of his life. There was one other black person in his grade, a girl named Coretta. They were isolated, watching each other from a distance. One day during recess, she started chasing him playfully around the jungle gym. They were laughing until they fell to the ground, breathless. Suddenly, a group of children circled them, chanting, "Coretta has a boyfriend! Coretta has a boyfriend!" Panicked, and desperate not to be linked to her, he stammered, "She's not my girlfriend." He stood up and gave her a slight shove. "Leave me alone," he shouted. Coretta stared at him, her face a mask of disappointment and accusation, and then she ran, disappearing from sight. It was an act of betrayal that would haunt him. He had been tested and found wanting. In that moment of choosing acceptance over loyalty, he had trampled on a part of himself. From that day forward, he took refuge in the soft, forgiving bosom of America's consumer culture, watching TV and trying not to think too hard about who he was. Then, one day, the myth came to life. A telegram arrived. His father was coming for Christmas. For a month, the ghost he had wrestled with became flesh and blood. He was thinner than the story suggested, with a slight limp from a bad car accident. He was charming and intelligent, and the family seemed to come alive in his presence. But he was also a stranger. And soon, the tension began to build. One evening, his father told him to turn off the television, a Christmas special, and study instead. The command sparked a massive argument. His grandfather insisted it was his house. His grandmother said his father had no right to bully everyone after being gone for so long. It was in that fight that the young Barack saw the cracks in the family narrative. He began to count the days until his father would leave. But before he left, something incredible happened. His father was invited to speak at his school. Barack was terrified. He had been telling his classmates that his father was an African prince, the son of a chief. Now, he was sure all his lies would be exposed. His father stood before the class and began to speak. He spoke of the Great Rift Valley, where mankind first appeared. He described the customs of the Luo, how a young boy had to kill a lion to prove his manhood. And he spoke of Kenya's struggle to be free, of a people who, like all people, longed for dignity and self-determination. He held the entire room captive. When he finished, the children applauded, full of questions. The boy who had asked about cannibalism came up to Barack and said, "Your dad is pretty cool." In that moment, the myth and the man merged. His father was powerful, not because he was a prince, but because his story was true and it connected to a larger human story. For a brief moment, Barack felt a sense of pride and connection that he had never known. Then, just as quickly, his father was gone again, leaving behind a few small gifts, some African records, and an even bigger void. The visit changed him. It made the search for identity more urgent. In high school, this search took place on the basketball court. Basketball was more than a game. It was a space where he could forge an identity. On the court, he found a community of other black men who taught him an attitude that went beyond the sport. Respect came from what you did, not who your daddy was. You talked trash, but only if you could back it up. And you never let anyone see you're hurt. It was also where he made his closest friends, both black and white. With his friend Ray, one of the few other black students at Punahou, he debated the complexities of their existence. Were the white and Asian girls who rejected them racist, or did they just want someone who looked like their father? Was the basketball coach who didn't give him playing time biased, or did he just prefer a different style of play? These conversations were a constant negotiation with the world. He learned to slip back and forth between his black and white worlds, a translator between two cultures, convinced that with a bit of effort, they would eventually cohere. But a simple, frightening incident shattered that belief. At a party with some black friends, he brought along two of his white teammates, Jeff and Scott. His friends were welcomed, but they were clearly uncomfortable, huddled in a corner. After an hour, they asked to go home. In the car, his friend Jeff said, "You know, man, that really taught me something. I can see how it must be tough for you and Ray sometimes. Being the only black guys and all." A part of him wanted to punch his friend. In that moment, he saw a new map of the world, one that was suffocating in its implications. The world was playing on the white man's court, by the white man's rules. Even the kindness of a friend felt like a confirmation of his otherness. The only thing you could choose as your own was withdrawal into a coil of rage, until being black meant only the knowledge of your own powerlessness, your own defeat. This revelation sent him searching for answers in books. He read Baldwin, Ellison, Hughes, and Du Bois, and in every page, he found the same anguish, the same doubt, the same self-contempt. Only Malcolm X's autobiography seemed to offer a way out, with its message of self-creation and uncompromising respect. But even Malcolm's path felt close to him. Malcolm wrote of the wish that the white blood in him might be expunged. For Barack, that was impossible. He was left to wonder what he would be severing if he left his mother and his grandparents at some uncharted border. This internal struggle led him into a period of rebellion. Pot? Booze? A little blow? He got high to flatten out the landscape of his heart, to blur the edges of his memory. It was a path toward becoming a tragic cliché, the young, would-be black man, lost to disillusionment. But something pulled him back. A conversation with his mother, who saw him slipping and feared he would end up like his grandfather, a man of unfulfilled dreams. And then, his college years at Occidental and Columbia, where he tried to find an identity in political activism. He got involved in the anti-apartheid movement, and for a moment, during a rally where he gave a fiery speech, he felt the connection he had been searching for. He felt his voice returning to him. But that feeling was fleeting. His girlfriend at the time, a white woman he loved deeply, couldn't understand the anger he felt, the anger in the black art he showed her. After seeing an angry, funny play by a black playwright, she asked him why black people were so angry all the time. The fight that followed revealed an unbridgeable gap between their worlds. She told him she couldn't be black, she could only be herself. And he realized that if they stayed together, he would have to live in her world, because he was the one who knew how to live as an outsider. He pushed her away. His friend Regina, a thoughtful and grounded black woman, gave him the sharpest critique. After his big speech at the rally, he confessed to her that he felt it was all a farce, just a way to feel important. She looked him straight in the eye and told him his real problem. "You always think everything's about you," she said. "The rally is about you. The speech is about you. The hurt is always your hurt. Well, let me tell you something, Mr. Obama. It's not just about you. It's about people who need your help." Her words hit him hard. He had been so wrapped up in his own perceived injuries, his own search for belonging, that he had forgotten the larger struggle. He realized he had been running from a fear that he didn't belong, that unless he hid and pretended, he would forever be an outsider. Regina's words were a call to a higher purpose. It wasn't about finding a perfect identity for himself. It was about connecting his story to the story of a community. This realization led him to Chicago. In 1983, with romantic, grainy images of the civil rights movement in his head, he decided to become a community organizer. It was a promise of redemption, a way to build the community he had been searching for. He imagined himself organizing black folks at the grassroots, for change. The reality was far from romantic. His new boss, a rumpled, cynical organizer named Marty Kaufman, told him that anger was a requirement for the job. "Well-adjusted people find more relaxing work," he said. Marty's philosophy was simple and unsentimental: find out people's self-interest, organize them around concrete, winnable issues, and build power. His work took him to the far south side of Chicago, to communities hollowed out by the loss of steel mills and factories. He met people who had achieved a fragile piece of the American dream, only to see it eroding around them. He heard stories of white flight, decaying storefronts, and a growing sense of fear. His first big organizing effort was a disaster. A meeting he called to address gang violence drew only 13 people. The police commander he had invited sent a low-level substitute. The whole thing felt like a failure. He learned a hard lesson from Marty: issues had to be concrete, specific, and winnable. He also learned about the complex and often bitter politics within the black community itself. When he tried to enlist the help of local ministers, he was shut down by a powerful pastor, Reverend Smalls, who saw his efforts as an intrusion. "We don't need nothing like this around here," Smalls told him, dismissing him as a high-talking, college-educated brother working for Jewish organizers and Catholic churches. But he also found allies. There was Will, the passionate deacon who preached a social gospel and wasn't afraid to challenge middle-class complacency. There was Drive. Martha Collier, the tough, dedicated principal of an elementary school in the Alkeld Gardens housing project, who saw the light go out of children's eyes by the time they turned 10. And there were the parents from Altgeld, young mothers like Sadie, Linda, and Bernadette, who were trying to raise their children between a sewage plant and a landfill. It was with them that he found his first real victory. After discovering that the Chicago Housing Authority knew about asbestos in the project but hadn't told the residents, they organized. They went downtown to the CHA headquarters, and when officials refused to see them, they held an impromptu press conference. The publicity forced the CHA to act. On the bus ride back to Alkeld that day, surrounded by the triumphant parents, he felt a contentment he had never known. He had helped people reclaim a power they had all along. That bus ride, he later said, kept him going. But organizing was a world of one step forward, two steps back. A massive community meeting with the CHA director descended into chaos when a tug-of-war over a microphone made them look foolish on the evening news. The victory on asbestos turned bittersweet when they learned the funds for the cleanup would come at the expense of other much-needed repairs. He was learning the hard truths of change. It was slow, frustrating, and often heartbreaking. He also learned that beneath people's stated self-interest, the desire for a stop sign or a repaired toilet, lay deeper stories. Sacred stories. Stories of terror and wonder, of sacrifice and disappointment. He began to share his own story, and in that exchange, he started to find the sense of place and purpose he had been looking for. Just as he was finding his footing, his world was shaken again. Harold Washington, Chicago's first black mayor and a symbol of collective hope, died suddenly of a heart attack. The coalition he had built instantly shattered, and the city's politics reverted to bitter, racial factionalism. The dream seemed to die with him. It was in this period of doubt that he began to think about leaving Chicago, about going to law school. Not to escape, he told himself, but to gain new tools, to learn power's currency, and bring it back to where it was needed. But he was haunted by the fear that he was repeating his father's pattern, leaving his community behind for the allure of a world-class education, a man divided, just like his father. Around this time, his half-sister Alma, whom he had never met, called him from Germany. She was coming to visit. Her visit was a revelation. For the first time, he heard the other side of his father's story. The old man, as Alma called him, was not the simple hero of his childhood myths. She told him of a brilliant man who, after returning to Kenya with his Harvard education, had been blacklisted by the government for his outspoken criticism of tribalism and corruption. His career was ruined. He began to drink heavily. His life fell apart. He became a bitter, abusive husband and a distant, demanding father. Alma and his brother Roy grew up in fear of him, living in poverty and shame. He was a man crushed by the weight of his own broken dreams. The image of his father, the one he had carried his whole life, vanished. It was replaced by a real, flawed, tragic human being. He felt as if he had been wrestling with a ghost. Now, that ghost was gone. This new, complicated understanding of his father made the final part of his journey necessary. He had to go to Kenya. He had to stand on the soil where his father was born and buried. He had to find the rest of his story. The trip to Kenya was a collision of worlds. He met aunts, uncles, cousins, and another brother, Bernard. He was welcomed with a warmth and an unquestioning sense of belonging that he had never experienced. For the first time, his name, Obama, wasn't strange. It was a connection to a web of relationships, alliances, and grudges that stretched back generations. But this feeling of belonging was complicated by the reality of poverty and the constant, unspoken demands of family. He was the American relative, the one with everything, a perception that created both a bond and a barrier. The climax of his journey took place in Alego, the small village where his father grew up and his grandmother, Granny, still lived. There, under a mango tree, as his grandmother braided Alma's hair, she told him the story of their family, going all the way back. She told him about his grandfather, Hussein Onyango, the man they called the Terror. He was a stern, disciplined, and fiercely independent man who had left his village as a boy to work for the British. He learned their ways, their hygiene, their farming techniques, but he never bent to their authority. He was arrested during the emergency, the Mau Mau Rebellion, and came back from the detention camp a broken man. And she told him, finally, the full story of his father. A brilliant, mischievous boy who could never forgive his own mother, Akumu, for abandoning him. A young man who was expelled from school, estranged from his father, and desperate to prove himself. A man whose life was saved by two American women who saw his potential and helped him get a scholarship to a university in a place called Hawaii. In her stories, he saw the patterns repeating, the same pride, the same fears, the same stubbornness passing from father to son. Standing before his father's and his grandfather's graves, he finally understood. The pain he felt was his father's pain. His questions were his brother's questions. Their struggle was his birthright. He felt the circle finally close. Who he was, what he cared about, was no longer just a matter of words or ideas. His life in America, the black life, the white life, the abandonment, the hope, all of it was connected to this small plot of earth an ocean away. The silence that had separated father from son, generation from generation, was what had betrayed them. He had finally found his father, not in the myth, but in the messy, contradictory, and beautiful truth of his story. And in doing so, he had finally come home. Commentary. Dreams from My Father is a book that stays with you long after you've turned the final page. It's a story that operates on so many levels. On the surface, it's a search for a father, but it quickly becomes clear that the father is a stand-in for something much larger, a history, a community, a sense of self. What I find so powerful about this journey is its honesty. Barack Obama doesn't give us easy answers. He doesn't present a romanticized version of his past or a sanitized version of his identity. Instead, he invites us into the confusion, the doubt, and the pain. He shows us the shame he felt as a boy pushing Coretta away, the anger and alienation of his teenage years, the moments of vanity and self-doubt as a young organizer. The central lesson, I believe, is that identity is not something we are given. It is something we must actively build. It's not found in a single place or a single story. It's pieced together from all the conflicting parts of our inheritance, the good and the bad, the proud and the painful. He couldn't choose between his white mother from Kansas and his black father from Kenya. He couldn't choose between the intellectual world of Columbia University and the grassroots struggles of Chicago's South Side. He had to find a way to hold it all. His journey teaches us that our roots don't have to be a chain that holds us back. They can be an anchor that gives us strength. But to find that strength, we have to be willing to look at our history honestly. When he first went to Kenya, he was looking for an idealized Africa, a promised land. What he found was far more complex, a place of beauty and hardship, of deep communal bonds and bitter family disputes. By confronting the difficult truths about his father, the alcoholism, the failed ambitions, the pain he caused, he didn't destroy the man, he found him. He replaced a one-dimensional myth with a three-dimensional human being. And in that act of understanding and forgiveness, he was able to forgive himself and find his own path. For anyone, but especially a young person trying to figure out who they are, this story offers a profound insight. Don't run from the complexity of your own story. Your identity is not a problem to be solved, but a story to be told. And that story includes all of it, the parts you're proud of and the parts that are difficult. It's in embracing all those messy, contradictory details, as he calls them, that we find a sense of wholeness. So, what can we take away from this? Here's a simple action you can take today. Find an older relative, a grandparent, an aunt, an uncle, and ask them for a story. Ask them about their parents, or where they grew up, or the hardest thing they ever went through. Don't just listen to the story. Try to understand the world they lived in. In their memories, you might just find a piece of your own story that you didn't know was missing. You might find that the questions you're wrestling with are the same questions they once did. And you might discover that you are part of a longer, richer, more complex story than you ever imagined. That was a summary of Dreams from My Father by Barack Obama. We've touched on the major themes and stories today, but I'll be honest with you, a summary is like looking at a photograph of a beautiful landscape. It can give you an idea of what's there, but it can never replace the feeling of actually standing in that place yourself. The real power of this book is in the journey it takes you on, in the quiet moments when Obama's search for meaning mirrors your own. This summary is meant to give you a glimpse of that journey. If any of the questions or struggles we've talked about today have resonated with you, I truly encourage you to pick up a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning the story of a famous man, it's an experience that can genuinely change the way you see yourself, your family, and your place in the world. Also, if you found this summary valuable, please hit that like button and subscribe. It tells us we're on the right track and ensures you won't miss our next deep dive into another life-changing book. Let's keep exploring and growing together.